Razam, thank you so much for joining me. How you doing, mate?
Pretty good, Jack. Really happy to be here, not just on your show, but on planet Earth in these exciting times.
Of course, definitely. I'm not sure the best way to describe exactly what you do, but I came across you and heard a bunch of your talks at the EGA festivals, Entheogenesis Australis, which was probably about 13 or 14 years ago now. The kind of the camp out one. So yeah, God, I learned so much from those meetings, those festivals, those conference festivals. But the camp out ones particularly were just, I was at a time where I was early psychedelic exploring and kind of trying to really just make sense of what the hell was going on. And somehow I got an invite to this festival called Entheogenesis Australis. No music particularly, just a lot of talks, a lot of incredible minds from all over the world. But you were one of them that gave some incredibly inspiring talks. But so that's how I came across you. But yeah, what exactly is it that you do? And I think you've got a keen interest in psychedelic and plant medicines and basically how they can kind of aid the human spiritual evolution, perhaps. But maybe give us a quick rundown of what you're all about.
It's a very good question, and it's one of those challenging ones for me to answer, publicly what I do and maybe privately what I do. I just said there, thanks for that shout out to EGA. Their Entheogenesis Australis were, the premier kind of psychedelic, shamanic, altered consciousness organization in Australia for over 20 years now. And I know this November they're doing another Garden States outdoor conference, so look out for that one.
Oh, great.
And, this kind of segues into what I do, but I started out around 2006, as what I called an experiential journalist, and I think I went to my first EGA in 2005, some of the proto meetings. And back then, this was before this current wave of psychedelia, where the mainstream media and the Pentagon and all the kind of power brokers are all on board with psychedelics. This was still in the tail end of the dark ages when these things were right on the liminal edge. And so we were underground back then, and so I guess been a tripper for many years, in the doof scene, in the outdoor party scene. I had a performance trip called Barrel Full of Monkeys, which did a lot of great hijinks. But I guess I was inspired a lot by, the electric Kool-Aid acid test and the kind of stories of Ken Kesey, the Merry Pranksters, and this approach to psychedelia, which was kind of life-affirming, positive, joyful, tribal, communal, and really reclaiming what Terence McKenna would later call the archaic revival. These elements of, ancient indigenous cultures, which may be the trance, the dance, the altered states, the healing, the communion that comes together from the cohesion of a social people, where there's not a war on drugs and there's not these social kind of, issues around the usage of these substances. And so that kind of party environment and festival environment really shaped a lot of my approach to psychedelia, because it embodied it and it gave me a way to feel the way these things can. I mean, a little shorthand, I'm pretty sure that I remember one of my first acid trips at, I think it was an Earth Core and maybe 98, 99, or one of those early kind of things where Australia was really cutting edge and we really had such vibrant communities in the outdoor party scene, et cetera, et cetera. But I really remember like stepping over like some kind of like camping, demarcation cord, and like having this realization that I was like stepping over into this limitless possibility. And I kind of, because if it's your first time going into what they call a temporary autonomous zone, or a liminal zone, which a festival, a party is not the usual constructs of society. It's somewhere of hedonism and excess, but also potentially spirituality. But it's going beyond the norm, going beyond the known. And I concretely can remember this feeling that everything society had taught me, good and bad, was a construct, and that I could step over and explore for myself these horizons, which I had no idea where it would lead. And where it eventually led to that freedom, which psychedelics really helped, reveal in me, was to know myself. And so the next phase was then to become basically a psychedelic journalist in a time where psychedelics wasn't really favored. And I was working for Australian Penthouse and freelancing, and I did some articles on Albert Hoffman. I went over to Switzerland somehow. I think I went on a dole payment. I don't know. It was really the old days. But to 2006, I went to Albert Hoffman's symposium on LSD. And Albert Hoffman, if people don't know, was the Swiss chemist who had discovered or invented LSD back in 1938, and it kind of came to more obvious his attention in 43. But it kind of set the world on this path of realizing there's a modern science of psychedelics, and that these things can be used in social conditioning and certain settings which can liberate our consciousness. So that was a turning point for the world's psychedelic community. It kind of got the world's attention. This 100-year-old man, he was still alive. He'd been microdosing LSD, which is anaerobic and oxygen supporting, and kind of the art of microdosing, which has now become quite pronounced in psychedelic culture, was still underground then. But he was alive and well, and it got the world's attention, this 100-year-old man talking about LSD, his problem child. And it was basically where MAPS and a lot of other kind of strategic NGOs did a lot of kind of NLP and coining this term, the psychedelic renaissance, which has now flourished and also kind of now going a bit off in its flourishing. But, I was reporting on these type of things and consciousness and spirituality, and that segued into my second assignment, which was going to the Amazon. This is stuff I was interested in myself. But, talking about the rise of the shaman, or the reclamation of this archetype of the shaman in the West, and the rise of ayahuasca, which in 2006 was pretty much the watershed of when it broke National Geographic, one of their periodicals, and started to come more into the mainstream. So I'm coming up to kind of 20 years of that. I still do journalism, but now I do a lot of coaching in the psychedelic kind of field. And I have facilitated a lot of medicine in countries where it's legal. I've done a lot of work with ayahuasca and was leading retreat groups down there for about 7 years to work with my shaman, Percy Garcia Lozano, in Iquitos. And then the Bufo toad entered my life, and I had that experience and became very much a convert of that, and supporting the community development of this medicine back into the mainstream, and helping run some conferences and other containers where the community could learn and grow what this medicine meant and how powerful it is and the safe and ethical ways to use it. And now lately let me see. I mean, I kind of been a very public commentator on psychedelics and shamanism, on spirituality and human evolution. And it's interesting because now a lot of these potentials which were really explored in the 60s have been commodified and kind of flattened in the race to re-medicalize psychedelics and bring them into the medical and insurance establishment. And so what a lot of us are finding, at least online in the discourse, is that there's not really a lot of air in the room anymore to talk about alternatives to the medical model. But there's a lot of exciting things happening with psychedelics. And I would probably have a blanket statement to say that currently there's probably more people on planet Earth using psychedelics in the 60s on an ongoing basis, but very fragmented and very disjointed in ways. There may be microdosing, or there may, a lot of them are using it. The Western media has been promoting the efficacy of these substances for quite a few years, if not decades now. The Pentagon's on board for PTSD for vets using iboga and the toad and other substances. Mainstream's on board. The mums and pops are on board with Michael Pollan, the famous New York Times food critic who wrote a book on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind. And there was a Netflix show my friend Lucy Walker made a documentary about. But all the mainstream now has heard that psychedelics are the ants' pants. Really, pretty much what there was like in the 50s before they were illegal as well. And so we have this strategic opportunity when these substances are not demonized, and we have a specific need in our global culture at the moment to respond to the challenges of these times, which is where I believe things like psychedelics can help change and elevate and repair our fragmented consciousness and the trauma of basically civilization and what it's been doing to us. And can help us be better people to respond to the challenges of these times. So that's kind of where my attention and focus is these days.
Yeah, not to sound too idealistic, but I often wonder about, when I guess Nixon kind of declared the war on drugs, and it kind of created a crashing halt to research, well, at least, public research outside of the, military industrial complex, I guess, all the research kind of came to a crashing halt. And I do wonder whether we may potentially have been on a completely different trajectory if psychedelics were never banned and actually studied, thoroughly understood, and put into practice before, many of the other drugs that pump through our systems to battle depression or PTSD or whatever.
Undeniably, we would be in a different world if that had have happened. But what you have to understand at the core is that psychedelics, the term was coined in the 50s by Humphrey Osmond, and getting a blank here, Brave New Aldous Huxley, in their correspondence. But basically, they took this idea from psyche, from the Greek goddess, meaning mind, and mind manifesting. But it's just a label. Originally they called hallucinogenics or mimetics. There was lots of different kind of ways to label them. But what you need to understand is that psychedelics change the structure of our ego consciousness. And our ego consciousness is pretty much what's wrong in the world. Not to kind of blame us and shame us, because I believe there are larger forces at work of why we have the consciousness we do at the moment. It's kind of tied to larger world age cycles and the emanation of consciousness. And we're kind of getting like one bar signal at the moment, or for the last 12,000 years of this kind of period of his story. But essentially, the ego came to fore, I believe, when there was a great civilizational disaster 12,800 years ago. They called the Lower Dryas extinction event. Almost everyone died. We went down to somehow they look at the genetic kind of phenotypes and they realized that out of 20 different kind of strands of different, variations of humanity, we went down to one. We almost lost everyone. And this is all verifiable science. I think it was a meteor impact or something that happened. But essentially, my theory is the current ego state we have now is a trauma response, right? I mean, I've talked to a lot of different consciousness people across the world, including Indigenous people, including Australian Aborigines, who basically say, using, our language, that the dream time is coming back, that there's this capacity that we used to have to be connected in a way that we don't have anymore. There was a fall in consciousness. And across the world, there's lots of myths and legends which kind of reflect this. But what I'm getting at is the kind of ego consciousness we have now is what we would call in psychedelic therapy a trauma response, right? It's very fixated. It's very low, narrow bandwidth. It's been entrained by the people that own civilization to be in this work mode of never-ending focus, and the only kind of relief we have from it are the things they give us, like alcohol or the downers, but they don't give us anything to accentuate our consciousness. So psychedelics, before they became psychedelics in the indigenous world, in the planet, in the earth secretes psychoactive substances. Nature makes no mistakes. We have an endocannabinoid system, which is over 80,000 years old. We've had a relationship with cannabinoids, i.e. cannabis, for at least 80,000 years, if not more. Our evolutionary growth has been parallel to our use of psychedelic, psychoactive substances, right? What we know with modern psychedelic science is that the traditional psychedelics, whether that's magic mushrooms, LSD, if they're from a lab or from nature, but essentially what they do is they lower or they perturb or alter what they call the default mode network in the brain. Now, the default mode network is kind of the groove of reality you're on when you're at rest, when nothing's happening, but you're getting incoming sensory data, right? And basically, psychedelics loosen that channel at the back of the brain, and they allow your sense of I or your ego to go in a journey into altered states consciousness. Now, anthropologists look at a lot of different cultures which use psychedelics or earth medicines, and they call them polyphasic, which means they have an ability to change the channel on that baseline ego reality. Our culture only reinforces that ego, and it's been many hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's painful because there's no escape from it. And in modern culture, with all the technologies and all the convergence and all the focus, everything that was meant to free up our time has instead made it that we are 24/7 on our screens getting dopamine hits, changing our neural structure. And it's kind of a ticket to a bad end here. But to come back to the point, psychedelics were often called ego dissolvers. And what they kind of do is dissolve the foundations of just being in that box, that one little box. It's like there's a whole spectrum, but we're only in the red. And we're not meant to be in the red. We're meant to live in the entire spectrum, and that's where the health and well-being comes from. So psychedelics have been called ego dissolvers because the ego of modern culture, from its trauma, has created civilization, I believe, as kind of a response to this planetary disaster that we had. And the ego is a wonderful tool, but a very bad master, in the sense we need our egos to navigate down here in terrestrial Earth. We need it to choose left, right, up, down. I like this, I don't like this, danger. It's always on, but often we get caught in flight and fear or freeze, or the ego's just so hyper in our modern culture with all the kind of triggers that it's sick, it's out of control. So psychedelics mediate that onness of the ego. They relax it. They bring it into a state of equilibrium from disequilibrium and from being so heightened in those flight and fear kind of responses. And in indigenous cultures that use things like ayahuasca or, psychedelic as medicines, they do that as a community, and they do it on a regular basis. And there was a study done in the early 90s with the Santo Daime, one of the ayahuasca syncretic churches in South America that Dennis McKenna and Eduardo Luna was a part of. And they discovered it wasn't just the ayahuasca, it was the cohesion of the community that essentially trips together, that then integrates together, that keeps everyone really good. They sort out all their problems, all the buildup of all the whatever they've been dealing with, that it makes them a more cohesive and effective community. And that's what we see in, indigenous communities around the world, is that historically they've needed the support of each other to survive. It's really on the edge of survival, right? And so these substances help them mediate the personal politics of their community and discharge any energetic things that have been building up and clean them out, keep them clean on a physical level. But number one, they mediate the ego. And so if psychedelics are the antidote to the ego, and the ego, which has built a civilization on the precipice of destruction, that is basically kind of destroying the planet because it's come out of its relationship and its groove of equilibrium with the cycles of Gaia, then psychedelics can be a cure in some ways. And that's a blanket statement, I know. But what we've seen since the 60s or the 50s and 60s on is that people who have taken these have had incredible transformations of not just their health and well-being, but their perspective of who and what they really are, their position in the world. And the vast majority of those people have then contributed enormously back into the cultures and communities they're in, because they've healed, because they're not stuck in that rut of competition, right? They come in this cohesive kind of collaboration. And so I really see that the future of psychedelics and of shamanic earth medicines, and there is a distinction between the reclamation of psychedelics into the Western medical model with the insurance and all that kind of overheads and red tape, and the more shamanic kind of ceremony where you may be sick, but you don't have to be sick to take these substances. There's different degrees of wellness, of spiritual connection. But there's different models, and there's also an urgency in our global civilization at the moment that I think psychedelics have a part to play in helping solve and ameliorate the problems of the ego and what we're going through.
Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of hear you put it like that. Obviously, the individual level of healing and overcoming blockages and stuff, but also just phrasing it in terms of creating a cohesive community and communities really working things out. It's a funny thing to think about how long these things have been illegal for when you kind of highlight some of the benefits like that. What were some of the psychedelics that I think really turned you on, or really just like changed your mind fundamentally, that just got you, okay, cool, this is worth dedicating my life to exploration?
Well, back in those party scene days, I've got to say my first kind of psychedelic was LSD, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful substance. And it's not just the substance that you're taking, it's the setting, it's who you're with, it's how you are internally, if you're ready for this. And, psychedelics aren't for everyone. We need to say that up front. If there's any underlying mental issues, bipolar, schizophrenia, things like that, some of the earth medicines like the Bufalvarius toad with the bufotenine in it can put more strain on the heart, the vasoconstrictors. So you've got to know your substance most of all. But, I interviewed Jeremy Narby, who's a famous kind of anthropologist who's worked with a lot of the Amazonian tribes, and his kind of contribution came in his book, The Cosmic Serpent, which was documenting a lot of his work with these tribes who work with ayahuasca. And they were saying essentially that they would see kind of the double helix, like why do we see snakes on ayahuasca all the time, this iconography or patterning? And his kind of interpretation was that we're able to visualize kind of the double helix DNA strands of DNA, that there's applicability and there's usage of these things. But what he also told me was that essentially in many indigenous cultures around the world, psychedelics are used either with men or women in certain containers and certain settings, but they're often an initiation ritual. And they're used specifically for boys becoming men, because women, when they have their period and their moon time and the ovulation cycle starts, that anchors them not just to themselves, but to the moon and the cycles and the earth, and they have an anchoring, but boys don't. And so oftentimes you see this in Western culture when boys to men, and there's obviously socioeconomic and a lot of other factors, but it's often that they're pushing against the world because they don't know where the edge is, and you can't feel safe until you know that you're held and it's contained. So a lot of boys kind of push against this edge and push against the culture because they're never embraced enough to know what their place is properly. So indigenous cultures give them psychedelics or earth medicines used in a responsible, mature setting with a guide or an elder who's leading them. But what they say is the experience of going beyond yourself, beyond your ego, and feeling nature. Because the other thing these do, and we can talk about this a bit later, there's some scientific studies which have proven this in recent times. They call the potential of psychedelics to be used to mediate your relationship with nature. And, over 51% of people in the modern 21st century live in cities. And they're kind of, it's like we don't know. We don't know where our food comes from. It's not from the supermarket. We don't know where our water comes from. Everything's kind of polluted and degraded, but we don't have a primary relationship with nature. And we might hear about it or see it on a screen, but, nature and what happens in the exchange with your biome and with all the microorganisms and with the energetic exchange, it's primal. It's the mother. And indigenous cultures across the planet revere the earth as the mother, but we've forgotten. So when indigenous tribes of boys take things like ayahuasca, they're not just purging and cleansing any parasites and things in their body physically. They're not just having random visions of what's beautiful things. Quite often, and this is the potential of psychedelics, what they call ecodelics, to bond you to nature. They've done a study showing that for at least a year afterwards, people that have profound psychedelic experiences in nature feel a connection to nature that is actually the default fundamental relationship all indigenous people have with nature, right? Nature, who also secretes the psychedelics, the psychoactives, which are meant to plug into our brains, and we have brain structures to receive them in, which modulate the ego and keep us in concert with nature. So there's something very profound. And in the West, what's happened is that psychedelics have become an initiation, but in a very looser way, in a way which is kind of a rebellious way, in a way that maybe people do drugs or something and they don't tell their parents, and it's all hidden and it's subterfuge and it has a negative connotation. But all I'm saying is indigenous cultures have none of the negativity, and they understand it's a necessary step in your psychic evolution as a human being to know who and what you are. But you can't know who you are when you're stuck in you. You have to go outside of yourself to be able to look back at yourself to know what you're in. You've got to get outside the box. And that's what psychedelics can do in a safe, sacred, and sound container with the right guidance and tutelage. And so, what's happening in the West, since the 60s on, was this, and a lot of it was, there's a lot of gray areas, because we do know that the MK Ultra and the CIA were behind a vast amount of the LSD usage in America and North America at least. And there seems to have been some type of grand social engineering program to stretch the linear consciousness of white picket fence America back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But I mean, people will have to do their own Google searches on this, but there's volumes of documented research on this in how the government was basically experimenting with the whole culture back then and pumping out a lot of LSD. In the 50s, it originated in a lot of the psychotherapy clinics, and then they would be giving people basically LSD, because that LSD was kind of the first Western psychedelic, we could say. It's one molecule different from LSA, the morning glory seeds used by indigenous tribes in Mesoamerica. And it has a potential to kind of lower the default mode network and to kind of deepen your sensory information, to take in more information. It can, on larger doses, I've never really had visions of ayahuasca. I've had, frame rate distortions where we don't notice how our consciousness works, but on LSD you do, because you become hyper aware of everything. And in a millisecond, you get a download of information. And so you can almost even see basically the eye passes information about 22, 23 frames a second. So it's like the old cartoons, it animates, but it's actually static frames. And on LSD, sometimes you're getting so much bandwidth of information that you kind of almost see under the hood of how you're processing stuff. And sometimes that can be hallucinations. There's a famous, I think he's a theologian, called Chris Bush. He's written a book called Turning the Diamonds. It's something like that. I'm forgetting the title exactly. Diamonds were in the title. But he, over a 20-year period, took very high doses of LSD, like mega doses. And he would kind of go inwards in the classic 60s style, the eye mask on, as an exploratory kind of, exploration of consciousness itself. And on those kind of doses and on that kind of setting, it can be intensely visual. But traditionally, on the outward open eyes, it's less visionary and less kind of more maybe distorting or accentuating. But essentially in the 60s, LSD blew open the minds of a generation. And there's conjecture that it basically also kind of dethroned the anti-war movement, which was building up to about 61, 62. And everyone who was in the anti-war movement in the States, or that youth generation, kind of got turned on and kind of got pacified by the LSD. But it always has these flow-through effects that the establishment can't control. And really what it did is that it tuned everyone in to what being human really means. It's not about all the mental stuff. It's not about all the money and the finance and the climbing and the competition. It's about the simple things. We had the Back to the Earth movement, the civil rights movement, all the social rights movements paralleled the LSD explosion, which changed the consciousness of millions of Americans and of the world, and of the choices they made, and of the choices what the culture would make collectively from the individuals changing from the LSD. So LSD was my first sacrament, you could say. And again, the difference between a drug and what we call in more shamanic kind of psychedelic medicine culture, and a drug and a medicine, is intention. Everything's a drug. Like every food you eat is a drug. Every chemical is a drug. It's just a word, right? But we have 50, 60 years of kind of, negative stigma against the word drugs and against psychedelics because of what the power establishment did, banning them in 66 and kind of outlawing a generation of researchers. But basically it went underground, and it made it that the people who continued that work deepened it in ways which had a slower titration coming into the culture. But throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had so many psychedelic underground researchers kind of broaching the mainstream, or broaching the public discourse. We had Terence McKenna, of course. We had a lot of other minds and people that were speaking out more culturally and more broad strokes about what these substances are, what their potentials are, what essentially, to expand the discussion from LSD, there's LSD, there's MDMA now, which is more an empathogen than a traditional psychedelic. But then you kind of really segue into the earth medicines, which have been used by shamanic cultures for millennia. The psilocybin magic mushrooms, the San Pedro Washuma, the cactus, the Liliquai morning glory seeds, the Buffo various toad with 5-MeO DMT. There's dozens more. But these things have really built since the 60s, when the LSD and the more man-made chemicals got outlawed. There was a reclamation of going back to these indigenous communities around the world, establishing relationships. And there's been kind of these growth vectors, which are very pronounced and trackable with anthropologists, as ayahuasca, of course, which we should mention, the most preeminent of them all, which came to large awareness in the 90s through the works of Terence McKenna, and also DMT. So DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, NN-dimethyltryptamine, very hallucinogenic in the sense of closed eye visuals of circuitry, patternings, geometries, aliens, architectures, ancestors, transmissions, feeling like there's what we would call in Western culture the astral, or what we might call hyperspace, which is what they called it in the 90s. But the idea that there are dimensions of being that we can access or visualize or connect with through the usage of these substances, which are changing our consciousness and tuning us in to all the vibratory realities which exist, and which basically, physics says. I mean, there's a convergence between physics, astrophysics, quantum physics, and psychedelic thought. They're just different languages and different frames to dice up the same reality grid. But everyone's kind of agreeing there's more than just the baseline reality, and that we have these tools at our disposal that aren't just drugs. They're kind of they're replicable technologies of the sacred, because one thing that they can do is it's not about the mind. That's why the psyche bit of the psychedelics is kind of a misnomer. It's heart. They can be heart opening. They can be healing. And what's been happening, so from the 60s to, let's say, the 90s, or into the noughts, it was the shamanic, I call it the global shamanic resurgence. The ayahuasca, the San Pedro, all the plants were coming out. Westerners were going to the indigenous communities and then coming back. And then by about, post 2006 in Albert Hofmann's conference, when the whole world media was realizing psychedelics could be brought back into the medical model, they also started to do a lot more studies for the last 20 years on ayahuasca, on psilocybin. We're now, 20 years later, for instance, here in Australia for almost 2 years now, I mean, sounds good on paper, but we have a legal permission to use both MDMA and psilocybin in very, very narrow bandwidth case usages for chronic untreatable PTSD. It has to fit very narrow bandwidth definitions. And we have therapists that have been training here in Australia and around the world for using these psychedelic substances for the healing of their client patients, because there's been so many studies which show as we lower the default mode network, or as we lower the ego with 5-MeO, they all do slightly different things, we kind of clean out the cache. The configuration of our minds is like a cork on a bottle, holding in all the energetic buildup that we accrue over time. We go through traumatic circumstances and we may talk it through. We may intellectually in our mind go, yeah, I forgive that person. But the energy lodges in our energy bodies, our light bodies, and our emotional bodies. And it builds up as disease, and we can have physical sickness or mental glitches because we're holding all this stuff we're not meant to be holding. Western medicine may not agree with that definition, but they're getting enormous efficacy and success in using these substances to help people with chronic PTSD, with trauma, with letting go of these hurts and wounds which has happened to them. And so these substances, even in microdosing, there was a recent study showing that the efficacy of microdosing basically means non-perceptible. So you're not having a macro dose, you're not tripping balls, you may not even feel it, right? A very watered down LSD diluted, or psilocybin, usually the ones used, but it's regulating your nervous system, it's doing something on this level. It could be a placebo effect, but there's quite a few studies out there looking at this. There's a lot of oral reports and anecdotal, but the theory is that microdosing psychedelics is more efficient than SSRIs or antidepressants. SSRIs or antidepressants, you've got to understand, the entire planet is basically traumatized on one level or another. And you can look around and see all the world war. You can see the inequity of distribution of finances and money and support. You can see the polarity in the world. This is kind of the culmination of, many hundreds of years of these inequities, but everyone's suffering. And so the powers that be, we could take a generous approach here and say they want to alleviate suffering, or we could take a more realistic, pragmatic approach and say they want a soma for the masses to keep them placated and keep them as good workers, to shut the fuck up while they still get all the profits and it goes back to whoever owns the system. Regardless, a lot of these substances are now have been studied to a very large degree. They can help people with traumas. And this is what we call the medicalization approach. So in America, there's an organization for over 35 years, the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, a not-for-profit, led by Rick Doblin. But over 35 years, thousands of good people have contributed to this organization. And they're the ones who have been dealing with the scientists, the doctors, the regulatory bodies, the government, the Pentagon. They're the ones who are basically pretty much single-handedly, in concert with other NGOs, have been bringing psychedelic substances back into the medical model, doing the scientific peer-reviewed double-blind studies, proving these things are safe in the right set and settings, doing the hard yards to get them back into the communities where they can help. And, of course, these beautiful kind of like, well, in some senses naive NGOs and scientists and doctors have hit up against the capitalist mainframe, because now what's been happening in the last 5 years is that the money people have come in, and MAPS had a B corporation, which was kind of a hybrid, which was trying to make money within the system. That's just in the last year or two been converted to a full capitalist kind of endeavor. And MAPS's last push recently in the last few months to basically legalize MDMA and psilocybin for this treatment of PTSD, which has kind of been proven can work, was denied by the FDA in America because of some trial concerns about the safety and efficacy. But essentially what's happened in the vacuum of MAPS not getting the legalization they've been building to for 35 years is that other psychedelic companies for profit, led by billionaire investors like Christian Angerman and Peter Thiel and all these kind of right-wing investors who have their fingers in many pies, what they do, they take things like ketamine, which is another man-made lab-based substance, which is a dissociative. It has psychedelic properties at high doses. It can be used for the treatment of depression. But what we've seen in America, for instance, is that ketamine clinics have been popping up, and there's kind of been a deregulation in the industry, and it's gotten really loose, and people can kind of apply on an app and get ketamine sent to them without supervision, and it's getting really messy out there. But they take something like ketamine, and then they change it, make one molecule different and call it esketamine, and then they charge $6,000. That's not a correct price, but literally something which costs 6 cents, which is what the estimate for the ketamine use per unit was, and it's literally over $1,000, probably even more. We've seen capitalism invade the psychedelic renaissance. And there's no turning back, and there's no real clear answers here. So what they're probably going to be doing is doing a variant on MDMA, which they're going to patent, and they're going to bring that to market, and they're going to bring that through to the FDA. And what we're going to be seeing in the best case scenario at the moment, like in a lot of places around America, on a regional level or a state level or even a council level, there's something called a decriminalized movement, decriminalized plant medicines. And a lot of places regionally voted to basically not direct law enforcement to make it a crime. And so in the absence of that, but there's a lot of regulatory issues and banking and finance issues, but there's a lot of states like Colorado which have legal usage of psilocybin mushrooms, and clinics and retreat centers, and industry is springing up legally but slowly and awkwardly. But it's for profit. And so the danger is in the for-profit model, it's not really about the healing and the caring of the patients. It is, but it's also within the set and setting of the capitalist kind of container. So, originally in Mesoamerica and South America and throughout Mexico, the healer, medicine man or woman, would be called a curandero or curandera. Maria Sabina was the infamous and beautiful archetype of, it's almost like the Virgin Mary. She's kind of like the mother of psychedelics. In 1955, she led a mushroom ceremony for an investment banker, Gordon Wasson, who was very high up in the intelligentsia of the time and CIA connected. And kind of she led a magic mushroom ceremony for him, and then he wrote about it, and it was published in Life magazine, the equivalent of Time magazine, in 57. And it basically introduced Middle America to these psychoactive substances. But a professional like her in an indigenous setting, it's about the duty of care to the people under you, and it's about the spirit world, and it's about the interaction between the spirit world and your substance. It's not just about the chemical that you put in their body. It's about these relationships. And in my decades of work with ayahuasca, it's the same. All the plant medicines are teaching us about relationships with ourselves, with components of ourselves, with parts we've hidden and denied, with the medicine that we take in, with the intention we do it in, with the skill and the care and the love of the medicine person. But even in the shamanic medicine world, we've seen that capitalist kind of, we can't get away from it. There's a lot of lodge systems with ayahuasca that have sprung up in the last 30 years, which are usually owned by white Westerners, and the money that's going to them. And we're kind of knee deep in this 21st century psychedelic renaissance, but it's kind of hit the fan in the last few years, and we're kind of figuring out where to go with it all and how to help keep it integral. And it's not just its fault, it's kind of the system that psychedelics are plugging into that many people are deeply concerned now that it's getting diluted, it's getting commodified, and it's getting bastardized within the medical system. So that's kind of where we're at.
I'm not like some diehard anti-capitalist kind of person or anything, but I do, I have thought a lot about our inability to maybe spiritually evolve or collectively as a global species. Like how can we? What would it ever take for people to put down their weapons and actually all come together? Like will psychedelics really do it? And obviously there's all the resource battles that we could talk about, but I do think that like part of our spiritual stagnation is the systems that we're beholden to. We are beholden to these the capitalism, the communisms, the all the isms, and it would take a massive revolution to completely restructure everything before we can move past that, because we kind of it is always going to be a dog eat dog world so long as we're beholden to these systems. I don't know how to get past that. I think, yeah.
But I mean, I can't actually remember if it was Einstein or Arthur C. Clarke, but there's this famous quote that the consciousness which creates the problem cannot solve the problem, right? You have to have a consciousness which is elevated beyond that level of the start of the problem. And you see this developmentally with children. It's like, I don't know, like you're walking along, you're learning to walk, you're a toddler, you spill a glass of water. It's like you weren't watching, you weren't learning, you weren't knowing. You've got to learn, you've got to grow above what creates the problem to solve the problem. And so, what we're seeing now isn't really solving the problem. We have these tools which can enhance our consciousness, and we know that not just indigenous cultures, but historically, psychedelics were used all across the world. There's so many books out now looking at prehistory and the use of entheogens. And it kind of feels like almost all these at the root of every historical civilization, they had an entheogen, something which revealed the divine within, what we would call a psychedelic now. And it was part of their ability not just to be in concert with the earth, but to kind of tap into that bandwidth of information that's available out there and to grow and to learn. So I know it's cliched, and I know it's like the 60s. Because of what happened in the 60s, there's been a political and a social stigma, which, has smothered all that research for so many decades. And part of the danger is, there was an uncontrollable messianic kind of fervor that happened back in the 60s with Tim Leary and Kesey and all of them, because they felt the revolutionary potential of those times, right? But that's why they shut it down, because there was a revolution in the 60s that was building from consciousness itself. They wanted to go back to the earth. They wanted to, husband the animals and grow with them and just live simply. And that was a threat to kind of the machinery of the economy, right? But we know, what do they say now? There's no trees on a dead earth, or no jobs on a dead earth. And we know that we're actually in this phase in 2025 where it's been 5 years since all the COVID shit hit the fan. It's been 5 years since the WEF announced we were going to have a great reset. We can kind of see in the world that we're actually in a time of great revolution, socio-politically, economically, and environmentally. And it's just speeding up and quickening, and the revolution is happening whether we want it or not. But who's controlling it? It's not the people. For the last decades, like every time there's a social movement, it gets quashed. I remember I was at the Battle of Seattle, or in Melbourne, when we're having the anti-globalization protests in '99, and that kind of got detoned and squashed. And then in 2010, there was that Occupy movement. Any legitimate social movement immediately gets squashed by the powers that be, right? And they want these people pacified. And so this is kind of what we're saying. Everyone knows there needs to be a change in the way we're living on planet Earth. There has to be a change. We can't continue the way we're going for so many reasons we could all name. But it never happens because the powers that be control the sandbox. And so, there's this slow percolating thing. I mean, I believe there's a great author called Jamie Wheel, and he wrote the Stealing Fire book 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, a New York Times bestseller. And it was kind of more Silicon Valley, West Coast America kind of optimization of the entrepreneurial mindset, using technology and psychedelics to optimize our beings. How can we have another Promethean revolution when we're stealing the fire of the gods? And he's a great guy, and I've got his newsletter. And a couple of weeks ago in his newsletter, he was commenting on all this social unrest in the world and the Trumpian stuff and the way it's all hitting the fan. And he was saying, well, what's the psychedelic community going? And there's a few options, It's like, well, the medicalization model, not going to change anything, right? It might replace antidepressants. It will help a lot of people within the system who can afford $3,000 to $6,000 for an 8-hour psilocybin session with 2 therapists under their insurance model, but it's not going to help everyone. There's also, as I said earlier, this decriminalization movement and like this plant empowerment movement, which is encouraging a more decentralized approach to shamanic medicine ceremonies, to make them not about the money, to have an entry point for the community. And that really is, I think, the way it should go in terms of community-based ceremonies and figuring out, like with Santa Daime, they grow their own ayahuasca, and then they sing to it and they purify it and they pray to it and they drink it together. And then, it's a different experience when you're engaged with the medicine in that way, that you have a connection to it that's deeper than a peak experience. You paid $500 for a ceremony, you rock up and you've been busy all day at work and you've just left the office cubicle and you come to your ayahuasca ceremony and you drink your ayahuasca and you have maybe a beautiful experience, and then you go back home and then you go back to work on Monday. Nothing changes. Maybe you get rid of some childhood trauma, and then maybe you're a better worker and you're more efficient at your job and you get a raise, But then meanwhile, the next week the company collapses because it's all been outsourced to China. It's not going to change anything. It's going to change people who can afford the medical model, right? The next model, as I call it, the global shamanic resurgence, it is changing things, but it's kind of still stuck in that same interface of how do we get to enough people when the people are usually spiritual pilgrims going back to Peru or South America or other places to experience these medicines under the tutelage of experienced medicine indigenous people, men and women, and they can have profound effects. And there's been a whole generation or two now where some people that experience profound healing on things like ayahuasca or bufo toad then feel like they want to share it with others, and they feel like they want to take on the responsibility of being practitioners or facilitators or providers of these medicines. But it's all underground. But there has been a great upsurge in this shamanic movement of having, I like to say that ayahuasca kind of came out of the jungles, let's call it in the 90s. One of the first Western lodges was in 1990, the Sachamama Lodge outside of Quitos with Don, I'm forgetting which Don it was, one of the ayahuasqueros. But it's been like 30 plus years or longer where ayahuasca has lodges to receive Westerners in South America. And a lot of those, I'd say maybe under 10%, but enough people have come back and have learnt how to work with these medicines, sometimes most often in a diluted way that doesn't have the decades of training that the indigenous people do with things like ayahuasca. But it's still reaching out to embrace the world, that vine of ayahuasca. And there's kind of neo-shamans now, which are around, and there's good things and bad things about that. And I've spent a lot of time in my outreach, in my kind of community development in China, in train. Since 2015, a whole generation of people that have been working with the bufo various toad, rightly or wrongly, into best practices, into safe containers, and trying to help people support themselves so they can support their communities. I would say that the global shamanic resurgence and the underground usage of these substances is at least 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 of what is in the current medical model, because the medical model hasn't taken. It's all in infrastructure building at the moment in the West. And so people are getting healing. And when Michael Pollan released that How to Change Your Mind book, it was a New York Times bestseller. It's like tens of millions of people heard the message, but there's no legal recourse for them to go to a legal therapist above ground in their insurance model. very, very few. In very, very few, you can go to Colorado, you can go to certain areas in America. So the vast majority of those people were pushed into the underground, and through word of mouth and through social networks have discovered that there are practitioners who are serving these powerful earth medicines, hopefully in an integral and ethical way. And so there's a whole generation and a lot of teething issues around that. But we have reclaimed the shamanic model in the West, undeniably. It's just that it's not as visible in the mainstream. But you're seeing it percolate out. And back when I was reporting on ayahuasca, I've written 2 books on ayahuasca. You can find them on my website, razam.com. But I did a book called Aya Awakenings, which later became a documentary film. And I did the ayahuasca sessions, which was, interviews with ayahuasqueros and curanderos and people in the medicine communities, both Western and Indigenous. And, basically there's been this growth spurt and there's been this interaction where we have reclaimed it to a very large degree, but it's still growing and there's a lot of teething issues on it. So now we find ourselves at this juncture where it's like, what next? And as you were saying, it's like, I feel that we can't evolve beyond the consciousness we've got without help. There's still a Judeo-Christianic kind of taint over what some people could call, in maybe the more spiritual circles, the left-hand path, right? That, oh my God, you're taking a drug to accentuate your consciousness. Isn't that cheating? Isn't that illegal? Can't I just meditate in a cave or meditate in my room before work for an hour each day? Won't that save the planet? It can. If you have a dedicated practice, and if enough people en masse have a dedicated practice which tunes them into whatever they define it is that they're connecting to, that's beautiful. But what we found with psychedelics is, with meditation, for instance, all the Eightfold Path of yoga and all the ancient techniques have been woefully commodified and diluted down to kind of like, some kind of hip hop yoga class, which is nothing wrong with it. It's good exercise. But the ancients, right, they developed these techniques to crack open your consciousness and to reveal the divine within. Most people don't even believe in the divine anymore, right? And they don't even know the planet's alive and it's an organism and it's going through these earth changes which happen cyclically every 12,000 years, and that everything's hitting the fan just as it's meant to be, and the guy is in her birth canal and everything's churning along and we're having to survive these changes. But what I'm getting at is, there are techniques that we can utilize, but even the techniques that we know of in the West aren't being used effectively because we don't have the teachers and the elders, but they're coming. There are enough people that know, but there needs to be an entrainment. So you can meditate for 20 years and have a nice, relaxing kind of headspace. We know that in the Vedic maps of consciousness, they call what we call the mind sattva, and they say it's like an ocean, and that we live on the surface of the ocean, and the rippling waves are our endless egoic thoughts, endlessly waving and hitting the shore and thinking again. It just doesn't stop. Most meditation is learning to not feed the thoughts, but maybe you can, with training after many years, stop the thoughts. Maybe you're a natural, can do that automatically. I can't, because I've got a very busy mind. And I know most people in our culture, because we're so hyper mediated by our technologies, the speeding up of like all the information ecology, our screens, the dopamine hits, the blue screens, which cause cancer, by the way, look out for that. There's so much happening that we are hyper stimulated all the time. How the fuck can we relax? How can we meditate? How can we find that center within? But in the Vedic model, even just letting go of the thoughts and relaxing into it and meditating is just the surface of what you're really meant to do with it. Essentially, if you go deep into the ocean of your own mind, your own being, you can reach what they call, you can reach Atman, or your true nature. So I mention this because I have been working for many years now with the medicine of 5-MeO-DMT, or 5-methoxy-N-dimethyltryptamine. It's actually produced in the human organism. It's been nicknamed the God molecule. We believe, along with NN-DMT and other kind of trace alkaloids and tryptamines, it flares up at peak experiences like at birth, death, near-death experiences, or mystical experiences, the commonality of which is this dropping fully of the ego facade, of this illusion that we're in, that we think we're this. So when babies are born, they don't have a functioning ego yet. It takes a few months, and when they're born, they are flooded with tryptamines, and they're in these unity states. That's why they're so helpless. And it's like it takes them a few months to come out of the unity into the I. And then as soon as they're in the I, it's pre-verbal and so early, there's Johnny, and it's like, I am Johnny. I am good. I am bad. But in the mystic and the spiritual traditions of the East, they teach you the eye is kind of an illusion. Obviously, it's real, but it's not the only real. And so what this medicine of 5-MeO does incredibly effectively is that they've done EEG brainwave mapping of it with science, and they know that when it's smoked and inhaled, 5-MeO, which happens naturally in our beings and flares up at these peak experiences, when it's modulated from an external source, smoked and inhaled, it goes from the lungs to the blood-brain barrier, and it settles in the frontal and parietal lobes of the brain, where the same geographic area where the sense of I is generated. So you can meditate for 20 years, and maybe you will go very deep. Maybe you'll become another Buddha, right? And there's pros and cons to all this, but you take one good hit of 5-MeO DMT, and you're going to go deeper, or as deep as the Buddha. Guaranteed, right? And we know this subjectively from people that have experienced 5-MeO. There is a lot of science around, a lot of neuroscience around. It can really only measure the outside electrical activity, but it can see it reduces the electrical activity, i.e. the ego, in that exact area for only about 15 minutes, because the body then metabolizes it and the mind comes back. Now, I'm saying this because these deep experiences mediated with this psychedelic compound can transform your life in a flash, right? And I'm not promising this for everyone. I'm saying, what is this transformation? It's the awareness of awareness, which is the classic definition of consciousness, that you are not what you thought you were before you took this substance, that you're not the I, just as the Vedas say, that there's essentially, the poet Rumi has this great quote, he says, you are not the drop, like the eye, you are the ocean in the drop. And when the drop opens and decoheres, it becomes the ocean again. It becomes the unity field. Whether we call that the 0 point, whether we call it God, whether we call it whatever label we give it, no dogma needed. But we're at an exciting time with these substances and potentials, because, as I say, they're replicable technologies of the sacred, especially 5-MeO. You take it and you can go back to this same space, and you can not only, there's not a lot to explore. It's a non-dual space. It's either the white light or this infinite kind of feeling of unity and oneness with everything. But to get to that, as the mind lowers, it's like a cork comes off a bottle and all the trauma story comes up, all the purging and all the healing, all the energetic stuff that's been nested and embedded within us that clears out of us. There can be healing. So currently what the medical model is doing is that they are putting tens of millions of dollars to 5-MeO research. They're calling it some other substance, buboprene, but it's 5-MeO. And they're wanting to put a patent on it. And they're wanting to do it in very small doses because it can be a catharsis to heal trauma. It's kind of like using the atom bomb to light the gas on your stove. Yes, it can light the gas on your stove, but that's not the point. That's a periphery of cleaning out to reveal the divine. And that's a classic example of Western, it's not just the medical establishment, but Western consciousness commodifying the sacred, taking the sacred and making it profane. And we did this over 500 years ago when the New World went back to the old world with the Spanish and all the Portuguese and all the seafaring empires, which went back to all the Americas and the Indias. And they found cultures which were using psychoactives like the mushrooms and the San Pedro cactus and snuffs and other things. And they declared it the work of the devil, right? And it's so ironic because those cultures were like communing with the divine, and these people who have this Judeo-Christianic thing and used it as a weapon to subjugate and slaughter tens of thousands or millions of people, which isn't a very Christian act, created this dynamic which still persists today. But we took tobacco, one of the original master plants, and in Peru we use that in ayahuasca ceremonies. In Peru, they have a language which is relational, and they will say that tobacco, or what we call mapacho, which is Nicotina rustica, it's 19% nicotine, it fires up the nicotine receptors in the brain, and it synergizes with ayahuasca to help bring on the visions and to stabilize the ayahuasca experience. In science, they would say, oh yeah, it's an agonist or an antagonist. They'll use a chemical language to describe it, but they'll reduce it down to a chemical when it's a relationship. And this is the thing. When I interviewed so many, medicine people and curanderos in Peru, they would say Westerners are coming in search of the healing that ayahuasca can provide. But the majority, some people are coming because they have a cancer or a medical issue and they're sick and they know they're sick and they're coming for healing, right? And ultimately, ayahuasca is not a magic pill. It doesn't just heal you. What you have to do to drink ayahuasca is go on a dieta, or a diet of eliminating the sugars, the salts, the oils, the alcohol, the red meat, the sex, anything which is energetically affecting you, and the cleaning out helps your body reset and then work on the issue. And they're doing a lot of energetic work on the astral with ayahuasca in ceremony, and the ayahuasca is working, but it's not a magic pill. But all of this leads to this idea that we took tobacco, which was considered the original master plant, and look what we do with it now. They put in something like 197 carcinogenic chemicals into original tobacco to kill you, and then they give you all this stuff that tobacco is bad for you. Tobacco is used by indigenous peoples around the world to pray, right? It doesn't kill you on its own, right? If you have an underlying issue, if you've got grief stored in your lungs, if you've got an energetic imbalance, it's going to do something there. But you see stories all the time, like 110-year-old woman been smoking for 60 years. Tobacco, obviously, it's going to build up on the lungs, and there's issues, but it's not going to kill you on its own. And I proviso, I'm not a medical expert. I can't give medical advice, right? I'm talking about my 20 years experience in shamanic culture and psychedelic culture. But we took tobacco in the West 500 years ago, and we made it profane, and we put it in a way because it calms us down. It enables us to. That's what indigenous people use it for. They use it to pray because it keeps them stable. It calms the mind, and then when the mind's calm, they connect to Great Spirit and they pray. Traditionally, in ayahuasca ceremonies, we blow mapacho cigarettes on people, the big cigars, as to create a conduit of energy to put our prayers and our intentions into people in ceremony. It's sacred, but what do we use it for? We use it to get out of work and go outside for 10 minutes and have a smoke, which is not bad, not a bad thing. It's just that they bastardized tobacco and they've made it carcinogenic. And so in the same way, we've taken all the sacred substances which were sacred and we've made them profane because our consciousness doesn't understand sacred, because we are out of relationship with the earth, which produces the sacred substances and is sacred herself. And we're kind of sacred, but we've fallen out of remembering we're sacred, right? And this is the thing, remembering who and what we really are is the change of consciousness we need. So all of these substances, from tobacco on, ayahuasca, the bufo toad, all of these things can be used in a way which can help or harm. And the bufo toad particularly reduces the ego to reveal the divine within. And the thing is, you could meditate all your life and not get to the depth of what in the East they call these samadhi states, this single point of focus where it's you, and that point of focus, I figured it out just the other month, it's like that single point of focus connects in that moment to the entire universe, and you can feel it. These things aren't about the mind. The mind psyche bit's a misnomer, because it's about your whole being feeling connected to the entirety of existence. And if that sounds like an outlandish claim, you need to do psychedelics.
Totally. No, I resonate with that so much. And, kind of talking about like the divine within us, I think that was one thing that I've probably throughout the, last decade or more of exploring psychedelics and stuff was always something that I was always stuck on. It's that rational mind versus that intuitive mind, I guess, or logical mind versus intuitive mind, where you'll have these extremely divine, all connecting to the entire universe experiences. But then I will come back and wonder whether, look, our minds are incredibly complex. Is that just a connection of the mind, and that does come down to reducing it all to chemicals? Am I just being flooded with dopamine or oxytocin and DMT and I've had the illusion of a God moment or something? But I think as I've continued down the path and actually particularly the tryptamines, the DMTs, the ayahuascas, and the 5-MeO DMT bufo, which is just holy shit next level. It is, as I've gone deeper and deeper, I feel that I've had enough experiences that at least makes me, I don't know. I mean, my attitude towards, like, call it God, call it the divine. I often say God because it's kind of the age-old question, but God is probably a bad term for it because it just has so much stigma associated with religion and stuff. But there does seem to be some kind of, I don't know, maybe divine intelligence at least. Maybe not an all-seeing decider, but just I often kind of call it like a witness, just some kind of conscious witness that is trying to make sense of itself, that seems to fuel everything, maybe fuel evolution.
I agree.
Fuel,
I agree.
Fuel
well, that's the
purpose.
That's kind of what they call the divine intelligence, or the divine blueprint, that everything is so, I mean, you know, physicists will say, and so many physicists were kind of believing in God because they know the math, right? And that math is like the language of the universe, is that there are so many complex impossibilities of like the orbits of the moon and the earth and the planets, and everything has to be exactly as it was. One little iota off and life could not exist. It's like there seems to be an intelligent design to everything. And now we've got modern days where, you know, simulation theory, and everyone's like, I think we're in a simulation. These are just different labels for ancient ideas of samsara, of Lila. It's not that what we're in isn't real. It's just that what we're in is kind of the shallow end of an infinitely dimensional architecture, which continues on in hyperdimensions, which potentially and most likely has its own intelligences and entities which exist in it.
I've listened to a few podcasts recently about simulation theory, and I kind of always rejected it. I don't know, it just didn't really sit right with me that we're in some kind of, you know, complex computing system. But there's one on Rogan with what's his name? I think Thomas Campbell. There was another one on Lex Friedman. I'm forgetting the name of the scientist. But there does seem to be this new movement of you know, scientists, of proper scientists who are exploring the ideas of simulation theory that do seem to be, as far as I've seen, the only ones really kind of trying to find answers to the big questions, like, is there a God? What is consciousness? You know, what even is the Big Bang? Like, so many of the fundamental, huge questions that just are intrinsic to our entire being are still not really able to be answered with our current scientific model. So we've clearly not figured it out. Well, but I feel like some of these, But, you
know, these are perennial questions over many civilizations that have risen and fallen before. I mean, in the plant medicine community, the Shipibo tribe is one of the main ayahuasca tribes in Peru. They say that the ayahuasca world that you go to in the visionary realm, and it's intricate, you know, in most shamanic models, there's this world that we're in now, and there's an above world and a below world, or they slice it up in different ways, but there's other worlds, right? And all the indigenous cultures will say this, and they've had experience of going into these worlds mediated through these plant medicines. But the Shipibo say that essentially the ayahuasca world is the originating world, the originating source, and that this world is the dream, right? And funnily enough, that's exactly what David Bohm, the famous quantum physicist, says, that he says everything starts in the implicate, which is, you know, a space, and that it projects from the implicate the explicate in a holographic universe. So this is a projection. They're all agreeing. It's just that it's so complicated. I mean, it's been over 100 years since quantum physics. I think it's the 1921 Solvay convention where they kind of pieced it all together. But even the quantum physicists were kind of like, okay, it doesn't make sense to the linear mind because it's actually non-linear, which is a psychedelic property. That's one of the things, and that's why it's so hard in a way to describe psychedelic experiences, because when you're in it, the ego is designed to pass linearity. And it's like, okay, left, right, got to move here. Tomorrow, I'm thinking about tomorrow, I'm doing this. It's designed for this terrestrial kind of container. And as psychedelics modulate the ego and drop it, what's left is an intuition, which is its own connection and own intelligence. And when we have huge psychedelic experiences, you realize, oh my God, everything's connected, all is one. But you feel it. You feel it in a way which is a knowing, which then by the time you get back, you can actually get down to writing it down in words. It's like it takes you, 50,000 words to describe the feeling of what you knew already, but it's kind of gone now because you're trapped back in linear consciousness. And so I think the more that science looks upon psychedelics as a science, in the sense of these substances are scientifically replicable, there's some really great exciting things happening with DMT. We're talking about dimethyltryptamine. The tryptamines are the most exciting to me because they're in us already. They're in all mammals, right? Except for birds. They're not in birds. And probably weren't in dinosaurs if we think of it that way. But the tryptamines are really fundamental to consciousness. We know that they have a very tangible effect. They help protect the brain from dying, and they continue the oxygenation of the brain in near-death experiences. There's been a couple of recent studies looking at near-death experiences where people have clinically died, for minutes or longer, and then they're brought back. And they describe where they were. And to a T, it's exactly what happens on 5-MeO. It's like I went into the white light. It was like a tunnel. It was like I felt like this connection to all things, but they've done some scientific peer-reviewed double-blind studies from the anecdotal reports of near-death experiences and these other things. There's also a great overlap between abduction experiences with UFOs, time dilation, entities, not just the big grey-head aliens, mantoids, mantis, things that are seen in tryptamine experiences. And remember, everyone has DMT within them, and it can flare up. They did these studies in the 50s which showed that essentially people that had schizophrenia had very high concentrations of DMT in their urine. So and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because in indigenous cultures, people that had high concentrations of tryptamines, and it could be a genetic lineage thing, they were kind of the medicine people of their communities. They were welcomed, accepted, they were given a place. Their sensitivity meant that they could connect to the spirit realm. And are they hearing voices? Yeah, because there's freaking entities in there. And it's like, and they're usually, you've got to be trained how to work with them and deal with them. And not all of them are good, right? But it's like, but you don't, it's like you cross the ocean and you discover this other culture, and then you're interacting with them and learning their language, but you don't deny they exist. They're just across the ocean. You don't see them when you're in your 9 to 5. But there's so many exciting things happening with tryptamines. There's a study being done in the UK, and also I think it's happening in Texas or somewhere in the US. It's called the DMT long-term immersion, or DMT-X. And Andrew Gallimore, who's just released a book on this and on DMT. He's a neurobiologist, lives in Japan.
You had a great chat with him, by the way, on your old podcast. I listened to that. It was wonderful. Many years ago. We did a 5-MeO versus an NDMT kind of webinar about a year ago as well. But he's a great guy, and he's done a lot of free content. You can check on his Andrew Gallimore. I think Alien Insect is the name of his website. And he's got a book that's just being released now, all about DMT and all the scientific studies. And what he's devised with Rick Strassman, who was a scientist in the 90s who did the only legal research in 1990, 1991 for 25 years. And it was kind of the premier and only DMT research again for almost another 20 years. And he's devised with Andrew Gallimore and Rick Strassman a protocol for intravenous drip. And so it's kind of weird in a way, because when you drink ayahuasca, you take the Banisteriopsis carpi vine, which has harmine and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors, and an MAO inhibitor stops DMT breaking down in the gut. Our bodies have DMT, as we said, but it's broken down continuously by the MAO inhibitors in the gut, so we're not tripping all the time. Some people are more sensitive and, they have these peculiarities. So the ayahuasca vine is mixed with DMT-containing plants, usually chacruna, chalaponga, sometimes 5-MeOs in there. And when you drink it in that liquid form, it goes into the gut and it lasts for a couple of hours. And so what they're doing in this scientific DMT-X study is kind of in a scientific, white bread way, reinventing. I don't know why they don't just drink ayahuasca, but they want to do just with pure DMT so they can measure the ratios and they can do all the science on it. And they're doing long-term to keep them in the DMT trance state for up to an hour. Now, when DMT is smoked, or it is in this IV kind of infusion, it's very, very powerful. And you have basically virtual reality type visions. But what we suspect and what indigenous cultures claim, and it's really the prejudice of Western people that are still treating indigenous people as noble savages, or that they haven't got a clue. It's our shame here. Is that, anthropologists have gone for decades to the jungles and said, well, how did you discover out of the tens of thousands of plants in the Amazon to take the cuttings of this vine and boil it in water for 8 hours with this plant? And they said, well, the plants told us to do it. And they're like, okay, obviously that didn't happen, because we don't believe in plant intelligence. There's a whole movement now. Monica Gagliano, who is an Australian scientist, has written a book called Thus Spoke the Plant, New York Times bestseller. There's a lot of confirmed research that says plants have an intelligence and an autonomy. Obviously, they don't have a brain structure, but you don't need a brain structure. Consciousness is received by the base station of the vessel. And according to the vessel, it has certain capabilities of consciousness. So humans have a higher faculty of consciousness because of the form of our beings.
but plants and animals and even the earth and rocks and minerals, and in indigenous cultures, they revere the mountains. They believe everything have a consciousness, and science is kind of coming around to that now. But all of this is to say that tryptamines are very fundamental, and they're doing this study now to keep them immersed in that very hallucinogenic space for up to an hour. And what they're finding is they're not doing these studies to say, oh, you've got trauma, can this help with your trauma? They're doing it as an exploratory model, which is so exciting because it's essentially in the medical model, but it's transcending the medical model to explore not just the human condition, but reality itself, and to corroborate the indigenous claims for millennia that there are other realms that we can access with these substances. And so when people go in on these scientific studies, there are commonalities where they can go in again and again, and different people can go in, and they're kind of consensually agreeing that it's the same geography they're going into. It's not a hallucination in their brains because everyone is experiencing these levels of the geography and sometimes the entities or beings that they are meeting, right? And so this is what Andrew Gallimore's kind of thesis is, that this is kind of a technology, this substance, DMT, that is in our brains, that we have had different ego functionality and configurations to enable us, like Dreamtime, to connect and see these entities being spirits. And then we've lost it over time. But then we can now reclaim this invisible landscape, this terra incognita of the mind, to go into these experiences and engage with, which may be contact experiences with alien beings that are just interdimensional, not extraterrestrial. And that's kind of where the DMT movement is headed, I think.
Mm. Do you think you're kind of saying, the intravenous DMT compared to ayahuasca, you could just do ayahuasca, but do you think, I mean, you would have had much more experience with ayahuasca than I have, but do you think that the ayahuasca experience is quite different to the DMT experience? Because from my experience, I would say it is.
Yes and no. I would say it is as well. Like, particularly ayahuasca can vary according to the strength of the brew, but also 10 people can be in a ceremony and like one person will be tripping balls and the other 9 will be like not really feeling much. Sometimes that can be the person and their energetic field, their stuff to clean out. I've had ceremonies where it's like ayahuasca's like, you're just exhausted, just go sleep now. And they're like, yeah, cool, I'll go to sleep, right? Or, 10 years ago when I started leading retreats down to Peru to work with Percy Garcia Lozano, I had 5 ceremonies over 10 days. And the first 4 ceremonies, I had no visions, no effect, no feeling. But I could feel it when I first drank it. And it would come on. And I could feel this energetic surge going down into my stomach. But in retrospect, what she was doing, she had to repair my biome because of all the Western bad diet, all the stuff. And your gut is where you produce all of your natural endogenous psychedelics. Your serotonin is produced in the gut. All your other psychedelics, it travels up to the brain, but most of them are produced in the gut. And so I felt that ayahuasca, originally in the indigenous setting, they would work with ayahuasca vine, but not the DMT plants. They would do it to clean out the gut and any microorganisms in the jungle which were making them sick. There's a suspicion with anthropologists that ayahuasca with the DMT brew and the leaves in it was really only starting to come to the fore in the 80s around Iquitos and that area when more Western contact and the tribes came together and there are other socio-political reasons. But what I'm getting at is ayahuasca traditionally can be hit or miss. And sometimes the first time you drink or the first few times you drink, it's repairing you, it's healing you, but you're not getting the visions because someone has told you that it's all about these visions. And it's hard to, in a snapshot, describe ayahuasca. I wrote a book about it. It's 400 pages. I made a documentary, and the documentary is only 3 chapters of the book condensed down. You don't really even get it in the documentary. The book does, Aya Awakenings, it's out there, a shamanic odyssey. But it's a profound medicine, but it doesn't affect everyone the same. And this is exactly the problem. The West is trying to take these substances, even when they're respecting them, but they're trying to make them a one-size-fits-all, right? And it's not like aspirin. It's not like a pill that if you're a certain body weight and you take this drug, it's going to affect everyone the same. And we're going to do 10 years of testing and sink $30 million into all the protocols. And then we're going to own it. And we're going to know that we release it in the market and it can be sold in supermarkets and everyone's going to have the same effect. There's no relationship there. Ayahuasca is very variable according to you, your blocks, your trauma story, your diet, the hardness of your head to be able to let go into it. and the brew and other variable factors. But then having said that, ayahuasca, I think, is superior in so many other ways because it's organic, it's long lasting. You just have to have a second cup. There's something about I deferred to smokable NN-DMT and then 5-MeO because I was not regularly getting those visions on ayahuasca either 20 years ago back when I was starting out. And I've got this, it needs a lot. I'll do 2 cups and try to break through. And there's this Western gung-ho adventurism which wants to break through. And I've done it too. I get it as well, right? But that's why we want to, they took another sacred substance used in Mesoamerica called Salvia divinorum, right? So it's in the sage family. And when Maria Sabina revealed the secret of the magic mushrooms to Gordon Wassoon in 55, she didn't say boo about the salvia. She was very canny. She only told Gordon because the village chief told her. It was authority, patriarchy kind of stuff. But they kept it quiet, and salvia didn't really become known in psychedelic underground until the 90s, right? And what happened since then is they took one of the most sacred, revered substances used by indigenous cultures, and they said, and indigenous cultures would take the salvia leaves and they'd curl them up into a little ball and they'd put them in the side like a coca leaf and they'd just chew on it and it would come on slowly. And so what I'm getting at, ayahuasca's like this. You drink it, it comes on slowly. It can be forceful, it can be full on, it can be super powerful, or it can be hit or miss. But there's a relationship which is, you've got to be more patient with it. Maybe you have to do a few more ceremonies, do a few more clearings. What they did with salvia, they reduced it down to 10 times concentrates, 20, 30, 40, 80 times concentrates. They sold it in head shops across the Western world, and people were having the most out-of-body experiences because they would smoke it, and it was never designed to be smoked, right? But you would instantly, like DMT, go from zero to an alien world where I've only done it once, salvia, and it was like I was visioning. It was like I was in an MC Escher. Every dimensional way was up. And I was like this figure, and I was like falling backwards into this multidimensional infinity. And it was very bizarre. It's like on salvia, you become the drug. It's like you're not just seeing like your lounge room. You go into the leg of the chair and you become the chair, and you can feel it. It's very bizarre. But it swept America, and they banned salvia because there was this wave of people smoking it to get high quicker than doing the traditional way of salvia. And I see that kind of with DMT, but I've been guilty of this as well, because ayahuasca has been hit and miss in drinking it, where you smoke DMT in the right quantity and you were guaranteed to break through pretty much every time if you find your right dosage. But there's still something in the Western kind of approach to it, which is more, faster, quicker, better, stronger, which kind of reflects all our colonial appropriation of all these indigenous headspaces and medicines. But we're also kind of the sickest, and we've done what we're doing to the world and have done to the world, and it's all coming home to us now, but we're in this time of great crisis, and these substances can be used, and I think we should use all of them, including the DMTs and the smokable DMTs to elevate our consciousness. But yeah, DMT is one of the most exciting compounds, I think.
I have heard that you've been spending a lot more time on the Bufo, the 5-MeO DMT. What sense do you make of the experience? What is the experience, and what is the difference from, anyone who's done DMT thought like it can't get weirder than this, and I don't necessarily think 5-MeO gets weirder than that, but it's definitely a step up. Like it's a different. It's very, very different. It's very, very, very different to NN-DMT. What sense do you make of it, and kind of what have your experiences and explorations been?
So I first experienced 5-MeO DMT back in 2006 in the jungles of Peru when it was legal. It only became illegal in some countries of the world in 2011 after it got more notoriety. And that kind of we kind of had a video of the experience on the outside, and I used that as the cornerstone for my documentary, Aya Awakenings. But essentially, I'd done 3 ayahuasca ceremonies when I first experienced it and cleaned out a bit. But to reiterate and to kind of reframe it, just to remember that both NN-dimethyltryptamine and 5-methoxy NN-dimethyltryptamine. So 5-MeO is NN-dimethyltryptamine with a 5-methoxyurine chemically. That's all the difference it is. Has an extra little tweak to it. It occupies different receptors in the brain. The traditional psychedelics hit the 5-HT2A receptors all through the brain structure. The same receptors that antidepressants occupy. So if you're on antidepressants, psychedelics won't work for you, which is ironic because I've just proven that psychedelics can cure the depression that antidepressants don't cure. They just band-aid and keep you on it forever. So NN-DMT and 5-MeO-DMT are in us. They're kept at bay by the MO-inhibiting chemicals. But we do believe that these are the substances which connect us to these realms, both within and without. And so 5-MeO-DMT targets the 5-HT1A receptors in the brain, and we do know that it is a completely different experience to the visionary experience of NN-DMT. 5-MeO is traditionally not visionary. It's traditionally kind of a death and rebirth experience. And again, remembering that these compounds are released in the brain when you are at the point of death, or you think you're at the point of death, and they're there as neuroprotective, keep the oxygenation going. But when we have a near-death experience, according to all the the reports of people who have survived and come back, everything people experience is exactly what people experience on NN and 5-MeO, which is what's released in the brain at the point of death. It's very interesting. These states of mind you don't have to die to experience. Not only do you have to take a substance like the toad or a synthetic 5-MeO or NN-DMT, essentially the human organism is wired because we have these tryptamines within us, but it works on the serotonin system, and the serotonin system is where the melatonin, which is also a tryptamine activated by light. There are shamanic cultures throughout South America and Mesoamerica and Mexico. Mantak Chia, the tantric master, also provides these experiences in Thailand called darkness retreats. And if the human organism is in darkness for 10 or more days, and they kind of set you up like at Mantak Chia's in a dark room, it's like a fully functional room, and there's an antechamber, and when they bring in the food, they're in there. So you never see light, there's no cracks, there's no light. And so there's a culture in Colombia or Ecuador called the Kogi, and they don't work with psychedelics per se, they work with energy and just spirit, but they're medicine people. They keep in darkness for the first 7 years of their life, right? And the thing is, and I did iboga, another powerful psychedelic entheogen, which is from an African root bark. And on iboga, I could see in the dark for 12 hours each time, guaranteed. It's kind of not, I saw something in my feed the other day, but the eyes are connected directly to the eyes are actually an extension of our brainstem. And we have this pineal gland, which has a lot of conjecture around the mystical, capabilities of it. But it also is literally an eye, the same structure as the two eyes we have. And the thinking is that at certain junctures, we can see light. We see light through the third eye in an environment where we can't see in the dark. So the Kogi and all these other shamanic cultures and practices keep you in darkness for 10 or more days. And what happens is the melatonin, which is activated originally by light in the morning, light is the original psychedelic. Dr. Jack Kruse with a K, Kruse on Twitter, on X, is probably the world's preeminent kind of light scientist. And all of our disease comes from dysregulations with light. If we have the early morning dawn and the dusk and we're getting that light, it's actually activating all these things, the vitamin D cascade, the melatonin stuff, all this health regulation in our beings are fed by light, but we don't get good light anymore. And we are on our blue screens, which cause cancer. Look it up. There's so much dysregulation from the blue screens. It's a different quality of light, which interferes and denudes all our health and well-being. These cultures, when they're in darkness, though, after 10 or more days, by about day 6, 7, 8, the melatonin's no longer produced because it's not activated by light. In its absence, the tryptamines organically, endogenously start to build in the human organism. So the 5-MeO, which is always there but kept at bay by the other chemicals, in the absence of light, by at least day 10, it builds up and you have an endogenous 5-MeO experience, a peak experience of, and on 5-MeO, you very frequently see pure white light. I mean, it's the classic mystical experience. People cross over, they're in a tunnel, they see the light, the white light. And people who've had these near-death experiences, that's exactly what they experience. And there's this white light. And you can see in my documentary, IR Awakenings, we tried to do a recreation audio-visually from my narration and taking people into what it feels like. But there's these qualities of light. So you have a 5-MeO experience, and then as that cascades and the flush happens and it subsides, then the endogenous N,N-dimethyltryptamine happens in the beings, and you have the visions come. And I came across this book in the yogic traditions on an ayahuasca retreat a decade ago, and it was basically just called Kriya Yoga. And Kriya Yoga in the West has been diluted to Kundalini Yoga. But there's a vast volume that has all these chapters on, you do all these meditation techniques, you refine your consciousness, you take your consciousness within, and you start to explore your own consciousness and then the dimensional consciousness you connect to naturally, right? And they delineate all the visions you will see, just like on ayahuasca, just like on psychedelics. They delineate, going into the shallow end of source consciousness, and then the samadhi points and the depth of the different degrees of samadhi and the immersion of the samadhi into the white light. All these indigenous and Eastern cultures have maps of consciousness which are real and they work. And we're kind of rediscovering them, and we're kind of utilizing the psychedelics to access them. But we have psychedelics within us. With the right modalities and entrainment, we can activate this endogenous potential without any external thing needed. And I think that's where we need to be going. And we said before about the left-hand path, there's still a Judeo-Christianic guilt around these substances as the devil's work or as cheating. Why can't we just meditate and do it ourselves? And as I was saying, you can, but you probably won't get there on your own. If you really want to access the depth of where our human capabilities go, these substances are there for us, no stigma needed, right? And it really is. It's actually an affectation of our egoic separation, which dares to say that something the Mother Earth grows, which we can ingest, is wrong or evil or left-hand path or cheating. It's like, are you kidding? It's like a cargo cult, or like someone who's been brainwashed for so many centuries that now sees the planet as something separate from us that we can rape and pillage, but we can't take the psychoactives that she produces, where we have entire regions of the brain evolved to connect to the substances that she gives us. I mean, this is the relationship with the earth. All animals like to get high. Google animals getting high. They're all got the brain structures and mammals. They all like to do it, but they don't have the dogma that says we can't do it. So it's okay to do it. Let's do it effectively. But the darkness retreats show us our own psychedelic potential without any external things. And it's a very empowering thing to realize that you have this divine space within you. So 5-MeO has been on the rise, over the last 10 years or so. It's actually been 10 years now since my first toad experience with Dr. Octavio Redig, who's a Mexican shamanic figure, quite polarizing in our community. But that was a very profound experience, and that really set me on the course of working with these medicines in countries where it's legal. I was leading retreats down to Mexico for quite a few years there. We were looking at the nexus point of, we were doing Vipassana-style silent retreats and meditation retreats with very, very low dose 5-MeO to deepen people's meditation practices, because meditation can get you there, but meditation with an adjunct or with a deepening, can help you get deeper into there. And I just believe that we've had a lot of time, it's been since 1943 that we knew of LSD. So we're coming up to it's been a very long time with modern psychedelics. And yet we haven't had full access without the stigma. We haven't had full access of science with the psychedelics. And now what we're having is this kind of weaponization of, you could call it of the psychedelic experience, where it's been commodified for capitalism and to keep people good consumers and to get them back to work. Or you're getting this thing where the Pentagon's on board with psychedelics to help heal soldiers. There's 19 vets that die every day from suicide. Things like iboga or ibogaine or the Bufo 5-MeO has been very profound, even ayahuasca, to help them heal from their war traumas. And there's a whole contingent of psychedelic advocates in the military now. But essentially, it seems the establishment is pigeonholing the psychedelic experience in a way to not let it challenge the beast that is in
Mm.
charge of everything. And I feel like we're in a real crisis on planet Earth at the moment. We haven't even got into the planetary emergency, but I believe we can use these substances. And to backtrack, I don't think I've finished talking about Jamie Wheel, who wrote the Stealing Fire book. He did a recent newsletter where he was saying that, you know, there's all these resurgence in evangelism and Trump and the right wing kind of America and the Christian things. When I would drive in like California for many years when I was living over there between LA and San Fran, and I'd tune into all their like fringe little hick radio stations where they'd be banging on about Jesus. But if I would listen to them with a 5-MeO lens, and they would say things like about the kingdom of God and all of these things, I would realize that if I just leave the dogma to the side and look at the core teachings of all these world religions, they say the same thing that we experience on psychedelics. And that my experiences of God and of the divine on 5-MeO, which is within me, has this heartfelt appreciation that I can appreciate the religious cultures that exist throughout the world, as long as they're not warring and as long as they're not trying to say that you're illegal or you should be killed. And there's so much dogma, there's so much weaponization of religion that has happened that now we don't like the word religion. You know, what they say is religion's like was when you pray in a box or a church, and spirituality is when you can go back to nature and you can feel it. No one's telling you what it is, you're feeling it for yourself. But I feel like Jamie had this little thing in his newsletter was saying that he sees this weaponization of the rapture happening. And I'm like, fuck yeah. I'm chasing the weaponization of the rapture, but I wouldn't call it weaponization. I'd call it mobilization, right? Because I feel like the rapture in the Christian ideology is the end times, and it's where God returns into the creation. And you know what? It's kind of what I feel is happening in my psychedelic. I have no dogma or what they're saying, but if I look at what's happening in the world, if I look at the resurgence of psychedelics and the amount of people turning on, if I look at the consensus of people who understand they have a divine essence within them that psychedelics may have helped to reveal, 5-MeO specifically, it activates you in a way that you're never the same. Essentially, that I have this 100-year-old commentary on the Upanishads, one of the ancient Vedic texts, and it's this commentary from a Victorian scholar. And he says that in his translation, he says that in the Vedic Indian cosmology, they believe that everyone has, in his language, the seed of God within them. We could say the seed of the divine or the seed of 0.4, so forget the words, but there's a seed of something bigger that you're connected to. On 5-MeO, I have experienced that, and probably millions of people now have experienced that. But the thing is, remembering 5-MeO is endogenous to the human organism, and it's not just about the chemical. That's just the trigger to lower the ego, to reveal what's behind the ego, a geography that exists in every living thing. But once you've had that full release and that experience, the connection is never lost. And the seed of God has germinated, I believe, in the bigness of the release on 5-MeO. And then the relationship with that divine space is what is growing in everyone across the world. So 5-MeO culture is quite uniquely placed because it also, you don't get this with NN-DMT. It's very not uncommon to have what we call a reactivation on 5-MeO. And a reactivation means you don't take anything externally, but it usually happens at 3, 4 a.m., which is exactly the time that meditators in the East meditate because the blood sugar is lowest. The natural 5-MeO is highest in the darkness at that time, and the mind is offline, all the precursors to going back in and revealing that space. That's all the medicine, the external medicine does. It reveals, lowers the gate to reveal a space. Meditators are lowering the gate themselves to reveal exactly the same space. People that have had 5-MeO experience these reactivations not uncommonly. It's not a glitch in the operating system. It's a feature of the operating system. We are meant to reveal the divine within. We are meant to be in connection to something bigger, right? And I believe that whether we realize it or not, we've kind of been switching on through our psychedelic usage back to the divine, back to the intelligence, both in Gaia, in nature, and what's behind Gaia and behind us, which is the divine. And it's connecting to us and it's growing within us. It's kind of formatting our vessels. And there's a grand potential at this time whenever there's so much unrest in the world and so much transformation, historically, usually erupts into world wars or usually is transformed. Like we can see there's this building energy in the world which needs to go somewhere. And so it's either going to be an apocalypse or a revelation. And so I kind of have a lot of sympathy for the Christian dogma of this idea of the rapture, because what I see happening with psychedelics, or what we call entheogens, which was the more politically correct name they did in the 80s when psychedelics were stigmatized, and entheogens in the Greek translates to revealing the divine within. It's already there, you're just revealing it. And so I would posit that over multiple generations, people that have really felt these substances, according to their language and their capacity to express it, would all agree that there's something bigger that is revealed within us that is on the rise. And it's happening at these times of cataclysm and world age change and grand civilizational collapse. So I say we don't have long left, and I really mean that. We don't have long left. And one world age changes and another world age begins. But in cyclic time, the historical record, which is controlled by the establishment, all the Graham Hancocks and Randall Carsons and ancient anthropologists, which just continually find these ruins of ancient civilizations, which mainstream anthropology tries to downplay because it would then prove that history is older than 12,800 years, and that there was ancient civilizations with technology and advancement that were destroyed in a cataclysm. And what the modern astrophysics is pointing to, in a nutshell, I know how crazy this all sounds, modern astrophysics is saying the center of our galaxy, which is a black hole, emanates a galactic current sheet which travels through all the solar systems on a regular 6 to 12,000 year cycle. It ignites all the suns in micronovas, which then have a solar flash. The magnetic field of the Earth has been dropping for the last 400 years, and increasingly in the last few years, everything is pointing to what they're calling in physics a geophysical excursion, which happens on a regular cycle in history every 12,000 or so years. And we're knee deep in it. It's a geophysical thing. The Earth is an alive organism. She's going to receive the signal from the sun and galactic center. And basically everything gets kind of Rubik's cubed on Earth. And at the same time this is happening, we have this rise in plant medicines and mediation of reclamation of our intelligence and awareness of the divinity within. And so when Jamie Wheal says, don't succumb to the Christian ideology and this whole rapture thing, fuck it, I think that's exactly what's happening. It's like the orgasm of the species. We have a very short amount of time to seize the opportunity and mobilize together, not from the ego, which will try to commodify and control. And basically, it's the 5 stages of grief on a planetary scale. It's denial, it's bargaining, it's rage, it's grief, and it's acceptance, right? And we're all in different stages of it, whether we know it or not. But I believe, there's been these meditation circles where they do, I think they did it around 2012 or maybe the millennium, but where people pool together and they're just meditating, but they do it at the same place, the same time, or the same time all around the world, and they're all in the same headspace together. We've been kind of floating this idea in the 5MEO community, and it's probably going to go live sometime this year, of, again, a global synchronized meditation for the medicine community. And everyone's welcome, but specifically those who have had 5MEO, because it changes you. All you need to do is drop that and it's already active within you. But we know people reactivate on 5MEO naturally. They're meant to. It's part of that. When I was doing the Vipassana style meditation retreats in Mexico, we researched it. And in India, they call them Jivan Muktas. It's the ones who anchor the divine within, the enlightened ones. So the first few times I did 5MEO, and you can read about it in my book or see it in my film, I kind of realized when I got up there into the divine space, when I came back, I realized, okay, it's kind of like the condensation cycle of moisture in nature. It rains, it does what it does on the earth, and then the condensation and moisture goes back up, and it's a cycle. Our souls come back down empty, and when we go back, we're full of information, and we feed it back into that space. And so it's a big experience, but then, it's a natural experience and it's within us. And so the goal is not to have these peak experiences with psychedelics and escapism and avoidance and spiritual bypassing. The goal is to format your vessel to be ready for what's coming. Because what's coming is a geophysical event that physicists agree is coming. This is all verified science, but it doesn't trickle down to a paradigm that anyone wants to talk about because it's kind of got a good disaster cycle attached to it. But we have an opportunity to activate and to come together and to have this cohesion of our consciousness by meditating together and reactivating together and accessing this potential that the psychedelic training wheels have been revealing within us. And I think this is the next step. So I think like a psychedelic mediated rapture is a wonderful idea. And I think I'll be giving that a go myself.
So, I mean, if you kind of believe this, that was awesome, by the way. If you kind of have these belief that we're coming to a cyclical closing and there could be some kind of end times, does that mean there's, are we able to fix our current predicament? Are we able to, is it all just going to become this giant orgiastic disaster of just, I think Terence McKenna had a great quote where he's talking about, we only become a spacefaring species when, the conditions on Earth have basically become so insane. It's a fire in a madhouse, I think is what he said. Is that kind of is that what we're destined for? Or do you think there's still hope for us all to kind of spiritually equalize and rise above?
Well, both those things need to happen. The spiritually equalizing and rising above it is the correct response to the chaos of these times. And the chaos of these times is only increasing exponentially. Currently, all the Arctic scientists are saying that we basically crossed 3 degrees rise in temperature since the 1850 pre-industrial baseline. It's all greenwashed, it's all whitewashed, it's all politicized, it's all misinformation to keep us thinking that we can actually control global warming. Global warming is actually not just human created. We have obviously contributed to it, but it's also cyclic. It's from the sun, it's from the galactic sun. It's cyclic, and it initiates huge earth changes, which all these indigenous cultures have records of, right? Of these climatic earth thing. And so the correct response, I think, is to rise above it. We're talking about the simulation thing. It's kind of, we're at the juncture where push comes to shove. And as we've discussed in this talk, the consciousness which has created the problem can't solve the problem because there is no problem, right? Obviously, we love our existence. Obviously, we love civilization, even though we would all argue what's wrong with it and it's capitalist and all these inequities and everything. But I'm going to tell you, I just went through, today is a week that I've been back in my home of being evacuated from a Category 2 cyclone that hit Brisbane and northern New South Wales. My house that I'm in doing this interview 3 years ago flooded like a meter. The owner of the house, we went through this so much fucking trauma and grief, and I kind of went into it. We were evacuated for 5 days. We were without power in the other place for 3 days. We were shitting in buckets for 2 days. It was all okay, but it was safe enough. But emotionally, it was really the ringer. And I realized this is it. And for me personally, I'm committed to, I know that we've crossed the tipping points and this is increasing. All the Arctic scientists that I follow, I can give you all links to. Look for arcticblogspot.com. They get all the data feeds. The ice, basically, the Arctic and the Antarctic are heating from below in the sea. It's not carbon dioxide from us. It's the oceans are no longer absorbing carbon dioxide. They're kind of emitting it. It's overflowing onto land. The ice is 98% gone in both Arctic and Antarctica over the last 50, 60 years. The 2% which remains is so thin, and it's going. By June this year, they think the Antarctic ice will all be gone. By September, it'll all be gone in the Arctic from their summer. There's going to be an immediate rise in temperature by September. This is all scientific data. I don't know how much, but it's gone non-linear and it's gone exponential, and all the tipping points have been crossed. And it's basically, it's going to be great upheaval and devastation on civilization. When I was fleeing and when I was, the cyclone and in my evacuation place, without power, without running water, without 1 bar signal on my phone if I went out into the car in the storm, all the crutches of civilization, or a lot of them, fell away. And I was like, fuck. I am so addicted to the creature comforts of civilization. My ego is addicted to the internet. I'm there fucking on my phone looking at the Facebook feeds that weren't loading just to have data to look at. I'm addicted to civilization. I admit it. right? And civilization is transforming, you could say dying, or you could say if Mother Earth is an organism, they call it Gaia, James Lovelock, the ex-NASA scientist who now developed whole systems theory on Earth and how everything feeds into everything. All these scientists agree the Earth is an organism. It's alive. It gives us life. And she regularly on our time scales, every 6 to 12,000 years, goes through these giant climactic kind of events. It's kind of like puberty. The Earth is going through these changes. She will survive, right? But most species on Earth get eradicated, and there's all these like ancient cave structures and underground cities that, the Turkey, there's so much documentation and evidence that all these ancient cultures which went through the flood and the deluge, and that was what's happening now when the ice is going, it's called isocaic rebound. The ice is going so much that the weight distribution of the continents is rebounding and the volcanoes are going off and everything's affecting everything else because the planet is a living, interconnected organism. It's all hitting the fan now. And it's meant to, because she's alive and she's an organism. If we try geoengineering to block out the sun or put more stuff in the oceans, it's just a bargaining technique. We're up to that bargaining stage of the ego because our ego fears death because we haven't crossed over to know what's on the other side. And indigenous cultures, shamanic cultures, meditation cultures, people that have crossed over, it's okay. It's safe. It's where we come from. It's where we go back to. It's connected to us underneath the ego all along. These sacred substances can help reveal that. They're using psilocybin, 5-MeO in clinical studies to help people who are terminally ill with cancers and things like that to alleviate their fear of death. People get a bit of a bungee jump over to the other side. They feel the bliss. They meet their loved ones. They realize it's all okay. They come back. You may believe that's a placebo, whatever. Take the substances and find out for yourself. What I'm saying is the same thing on a macro scale, on the civilization scale, is these substances prepare us to have the capacity to cross over, to train for this. And also, I believe that there's a great opportunity that it's not all doom and gloom, that this is kind of a simulation, and that there's a very narrow bandwidth of possibility that we can step up with these substances and training us, collectively coming together into cultural containers to practice being together, meditating together, being in medicine together, praying to the earth together to raise our vibration and kind of cross over or transcend in a way that I don't really know what that means. But none of us do. But this is what happens in a medicine ceremony. Your ego is reduced or collapsed, and you have to trust the unknown. And you have to trust that you will come back or you will survive or part of you will continue in something that you don't know is happening, right? And that's what these experiences for over 70 years now have been doing in the West, what indigenous cultures have been grooming and supporting us to remember who and what we really are, to remember what the planet is, to remember that there's more, that we can access these spaces, these hyperdimensional spaces, entities, beings, information transfer. These are the preeminent tools for evolution. And if we use them in the right way in this time as everything's hitting the fan, everything's in disequilibrium. It's not static. It's not stuck anymore. Great change, miracles can happen in these days if we believe, if we try, if we put it to the practice. This is like a science. It's not just mysticism. We have enough body of evidence using these substances, and we're starting to pull together in novel ways outside the medical model, which maps indigenous ways, which I think allow us a target window of opportunity that at the least is worth exploring together.
Wow. Amazing, Rock. Really, yeah, incredibly fascinating conversation and a lot to think about. I think it is quite undeniable that, I don't know, there is what do you call it, exponential growth of just, of things just getting more and more chaotic, and the rise of AI, which I really actually don't like, to be honest. Just the rise of technology and surveillance and data retention and the political systems just going more and more chaotic on the global scale. Whatever your political beliefs are, whether you think it's good or bad, I think it seems really scary at the moment. But our weapons are just getting more and more powerful, and there doesn't really seem to be a huge amount of anything particularly in place to pump the brakes on any of this. It's just a big, I don't know, juggernaut just driving into the night, isn't it? It feels like. I do always love to look for optimism, because I think we need optimism for any good outcome to ever exist. And I do think that the journey within should be encouraged en masse, because I think it does transform us. I think some of these tryptamine heavy hitter psychedelics really do offer extremely beautiful divine experiences, and they do offer us a way to step outside of ourselves to look at our own predicament, which I think is one of the biggest things that psychedelics have done for me. It's very hard to see the stupidity of your own actions when you're just in it, but when you can somewhat step out, you can get a little clarity, or maybe a lot of clarity.
Thank you. I agree. And let me just add to what you said, is like, we do need hope, right? Without hope, we're kind of lost. But we're in this liminal zone where the world we've known is no longer here. I mean, if we really admit it, right, the whole 20th century kind of stable geopolitical system, it's gone. It's in front of our eyes, transforming, right? In climate terms, they have this word, they call it hopium. It's kind of like vaporware. It's kind of like, we need hope, but there's not a lot. If the people who are really looking at the data are kind of like, the worst case scenario is by the end of 2026, the escalating tipping points could have resulted in 18 degrees. It's not good. But the scientists also don't have the full data set. They don't have all these things that indigenous cultures believe, this worldview, this interdimensionality, this understanding. I came back in my time of woe when I was really looking to all this, and it was during COVID lockdowns, and I was writing a screenplay set in the Arctic. I was researching all the raw data feeds. But I came back to the great Terence McKenna, and he has this overarching metaphor, and he says, say that you'd never heard of birth, or you'd never seen a woman giving birth. You never knew anything about it, Secret Women's Business. So you come across a woman, she sits there in the middle of the road and she's giving birth, but she's screaming, and there's blood, and there's this protuberance coming out, and it looks like something's really wrong. It's like, fuck, how do I help her? You're going to go up there, you're going to chop the thing off that's coming out of her. It's like you're going to kill the fucking baby, right? If we don't know what's really happening, we can't respond in an integral way. And I'll tell you, the powers that be, they're not going to tell you what's really happening, because they have a vested interest in keeping the machinery of civilization going long enough to get the AI up, to get it running in their underground bunkers to survive the cataclysm, which is imminent. That's what I believe. But regardless, they have vested interest and they want to keep the system going. They're not going to tell you anything, about it. Terence McKenna has this idea of what he calls the Gaian or the planetary birth canal, that the mother is giving birth. And she does this in these 12,000 year cycles. But what it means is great geological kind of surface of the earth upheavals, but it's natural. And we're not meant to change it. It's like we're in the womb, and this womb has given us birth. And civilizations rise and fall, but life does continue. And luckily enough, human life does continue. But because it's like the old Magna Doodle Etch-a-Sketch, clearing the board clean, it happens on a regular enough basis that we have to kind of rebuild from scratch, and survivors survive. But there's different ways to slice it. Is that if we're in this birth canal and Gaia knows what she's doing, it's like, if we go with it, if we're like, oh my God, the waters have broken. Okay, now we need to do this. The Hopi have that beautiful saying, and all these indigenous cultures understand cyclic time. They know what's coming back again. They've left us maps of this, which mainstream people try to hide and obfuscate because they don't want to understand cyclic time and that this is cyclic. But the Hopi say, the river is running very fast now, right? You can't swim against it. You've got to be carried by it. But look around you in the stream and look who's with you. Do you know where your water comes from? Do you know where your food comes from? Where is your land? Where are the prayers? Who are the people you can trust? And I just went through this with the cyclone. And this community in northern New South Wales is fucking resilient. It's fucking onto it. It's a shamanic community. It's a 25-year ayahuasca community. It's a ex-hippie community. But it's also a permaculture and an earth sciences. And we really responded to the emergency well. But you've got to come together, because what we're going through is the great change. And all these cultures are saying, you know, it's the start of the age of Aquarius, it's the Kali Yuga. These aren't just labels or words. These were astronomical cultures which understand the energies and what's coming in now and how it affects the earth. And so these times are the fucking times we've been born for, right? And this is it. We do not have long left. And I believe that if we appreciate what's really happening, we need hope. We need there to be a potential, because the 5 stages of grief, most people don't want to know this shit. They don't want to hear about it. Give me a medical psychedelic and then put me back in my job and I'll watch Michael Pollan's documentary. The shamanic culture is a bit more open, but no one wants to hear that everything's changing, death, everyone's going to die, right? It's a fucking not a good message. But the point is, it's like the microorganisms in your stomach. You got 7 trillion microorganisms going in and out of gamma cohesion, the same state you go into on 5-MeO and in near-death experiences. If we come together, we can hold a space which holds a potential to unlock our consciousness, which cannot fix the problem, but have kind of like an escape route or the next step, which is what we were meant to do. But like coal being formed into diamonds from the intense pressure, we would never choose that. We would never see this thing which is possible, because we can't see it according to the consciousness, which is just getting its Starbucks latte every day, right? It's only when we are really triggered to really fucking evolve. And there's been scientific American studies published recently showing that these lizards in Costa Rica have hyper evolved super quickly, not Darwinian generations, from all the increased weather and the storms, to their trackpads are super tactile now. They've proven that evolution happens in like days, or like really fast kind of hyper evolution isn't what we thought it was, because the DNA is designed to evolve to the environment, and the environment is going through the birth canal of these incredible changes. So we're designed to respond to that, but not if we're trapped in a little cubicle getting our, you know, lunch by the water cooler. We have to be out there on the edge. We have to acknowledge the edge. We have to explore the edge, and we have to dive over the edge. And I believe that the medicine community and the psychedelic community can assist in this, not by panicking and not by just doing all the negatives, but by saying, look, this is what we've done through time immemorial. We come together on or off substances, like we are the medicine too. And however, what's comfortable for you, we pray, we meditate, we focus our intentional energy on ourselves and together, and maybe on solutions, but realizing that this is actually meant to be happening. But there is a way forward, but we have to find it together.
Yeah. Yep. A lot to take in, man. And I totally agree.
I know.
You know, it's we have to. We are resilient, and we do need to start getting on the same page. I think it's as a species, it's the only way, right? It's the only way. Rak, thank you so much for your time. It's been an incredibly fascinating talk. I've really been enjoying listening to your podcast and in your old podcast in preparation for this, and just some of the various other podcasts and documentaries that you've been on and made. A really fascinating journey and very interesting things that you do. So I really appreciate your time, and would love to keep touching base down the track.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks. There's always so much to chat about. I know how dense it all is. If you're interested, just check out my website, rakrazam.com, rakrazam.com. There's hundreds of hours of free content. There's a couple of books and documentaries you can also buy, Shamans of the Global Village or the Ira Awakenings one. I also have a new ebook, which is on 5-MeO DMT, with a lot of those interviews from my podcast transcribed, which are kind of still cutting edge and world class, because it's not just the medicalization, it's really the exploration of it all. But I just invite people to come look at it all, because there's a lot. I get it. There's so much to digest, and I know how overwhelming I can be in trying to communicate it. I always get to this level of building the framework of trying to help people understand what's happening, and then when we get to the 2 hours later, when we get to the things that we could do, I have this little thing of like, what could psychedelic community do tangibly and effectively? And I never get around to that bit, but I've got thoughts on what we could do. Maybe I'll save that for EGA in November.
Yeah, great. And if you're ever up for it, part 2 would be awesome. I'd love to hear the next stage if you're up for it. But thank you again. Really appreciate it. And Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Have a bloody great day.
Yeah,
See ya.
blessings. Thanks, Jack.
Cheers.